Welcome to Becoming. We are grateful to have you in our audience. Today, our guest is Chuck Mollor. Chuck is the author of The Rise of the Agile Leader. He is also the founder and CEO of MCG Partners, a consulting firm specializing in leadership and talent optimization. For over 30 years, he has helped clients align business and people strategy for maximum results. As a recognized expert in leadership effectiveness, Chuck specializes in coaching and advising senior executives and leadership teams through times of rapid growth, mergers and acquisitions, and change. Some of his clients are Bose, Takeda Pharmaceuticals, DELL, Raytheon, Staples, Reebok-Adidas, Kayem Foods, the list goes on. He was also a Cranberry Grower-Owner with Ocean Spray. So Chuck, welcome. We are thrilled to have you on the show.
Well, thanks, Lisa. Kosta, very nice to meet both of you. I'm excited to be here.
We were really impressed with this book. Both Kosta and I have read it. And, you know, there's a lot of books that are written on management style. And sometimes when I read them, I get a little shiny object or get distracted and think, you know what, that sounds good. But yeah, it's a little too corporate. It's a little too, too technical. And in reading your book, I mean, there's so many golden nuggets in there, and they're so practical, and there's so many different levers that a leader could tap on to make some really incremental changes. So why don't, if you don't mind, just to give a little bit of background to our audience, what moved you to write the book, and why now?
So, no, I appreciate that. It's a very fair question. There's multiple things in that. I would say a couple of things. So it probably starts back in my journey, back when I started my firm in 2007 and when I decided to become an executive coach and also running and owning a firm. So I do both, which is kind of unusual. I'm not a solo practitioner. I've got a team of over 30 people. And, we've been doing great work for the last, 15 and a half years. And I'm very excited and thankful for the team that I have. But part of that journey was some of my own trials and tribulations as a leader earlier in my career. I was your classic high performer, high achiever, got great results. And then when I started managing and building teams and the higher roles in the organization, I was lucky enough to have a boss that asked if I had a 360 assessment before. And for those of you who are not familiar with a 360 assessment, essentially is confidential feedback from your boss, your peers, your subordinates, the key people. And it's really about helping improve your self-awareness, understanding how you see yourself versus how others see you. And I am getting some really tough feedback. And I talk about this in my book. And it was a very humbling experience. Of course, my first reaction was, well, screw all these people because look at all the great results I get. And I was only half kidding. I wasn't exactly the most emotionally mature person back in 1999. And my boss laughed and he said, I kind of feel you were going to say that. And he essentially said, the message was very simple, and this, I think we can all relate to this message in some way. He said, look, Chuck, you're always going to be successful. Why? Because you work hard, you get results. You've got drive, you've got passion, you know how to build businesses, you care about people. You know how to make things happen. He said, but you don't necessarily understand the leadership part of your job. You get the management part of it. But if you want to really get to my level one day, which is to be a CEO, you have to really understand the leadership part of your job. And that was the message. And he goes, why don't you think about it? Let's chat it in a week or so. And, honestly, I just had to get over, my pride, my ego. And I laugh, and I tell this story to many clients over the years, including my own team. They've heard this multiple times. But my lack of self-awareness was like the size of the Grand Canyon. Now here I am thinking I'm pretty self-aware. I think I kind of get myself, but I really was so surprised by some of the feedback I got from people, through this tool. So it really started a journey, which hasn't stopped, by the way, of really trying to understand what leadership is for me. And fast forward to your question about why the book. I've been thinking for a few years about writing a book, but I really, I think it's important to have a voice. We all need to have a voice of what we believe in, what we're passionate about, what our purpose is. I just wasn't really sure what I wanted to write about. And, this is actually before COVID, believe it or not. But I was having a conversation with my direct team, and we were kind of talking about leadership. And then it just kind of popped in my brain. I said, what's the future of leadership? Leadership has been changing dramatically the last few years, but there really isn't anything out there that's really addressing that. Now, ironically, this is before COVID, right? So I wrote the book before COVID. Fast forward, I published it during COVID, and it becomes very applicable, what we all went through during COVID. If I had to write it now, I probably would emphasize certain things differently and maybe put more emphasis on certain topics. But everything in the book is very applicable to what we've been living for the last 2.5 years. And to your point, Lisa, I wanted to write a book that was practical, that people could walk away with some practical tools and knowledge and techniques and insight they can apply to themselves. So the book really was about two things. One was about the future. What's the future of leadership? And based upon our interviews with CEOs and clients and research, we came up with this concept called the Agile leader. And then the other portion of the book, as you know, was really a roadmap. It's a roadmap for any leader at any level, including C-level, that says, how do I get to the next level as a leader? And yes, not everything in the book's going to apply to everybody, but it is a roadmap. I really try to provide a comprehensive roadmap of concepts and practical strategies and tools for people to really apply and internalize. So that was really the message and the story behind the book.
And that was the other thing that I know we both really liked about it, was that it really is for any level. Even if you're not in business, we're all leaders in life. We lead in some area of our life, whether we're aware of that or not. You have kids, you whatever it is. But so you were able to
Exactly. Yeah, and that's a really important comment, and not to overemphasize it, but we're leaders in our families, in our communities. It's more important than ever. Look, the world's not is more complex than ever. It's not simple out there. We're dealing with all kinds of messages, whether it's in the media, by certain groups and certain strong opinions. But we all need to step up, and that's what this book is about.
And so, as complex as this world is that we're living in, and so with all of the disruption that we have, what you seem to come across time and time again, and this book is a perfect example of it, is that the changes we need to make are relatively simple, right? It's not an overhauling of our personalities or our ethics or goals. It's kind of a tweak and a focus, and I didn't think that if I worked on that, it would have this much of an impact. What would you say are some of the most common traits of successful CEOs and leaders?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I think the intensity of change is intense as we've ever seen in life. The cycles of change are getting shorter and smaller. There's so much happening in terms of multiple generations, innovation cycles getting shorter, the pressures of globalization and competition, and the pressure of having to almost reinvent yourself sooner than later. And then you got the pressures of new employees and the focus and emphasis on diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, and Me Too, and all the other concepts that are out there that you have to deal with. So it's not easy. So to your point, what do leaders need to do? Now, some of this is counterintuitive, but hopefully this will make sense. Slow down. We all move so quickly, and we all live in the now. And trust me, I move 100 plus miles an hour myself, and I'm a pretty intense guy. But we have to create time for self-reflection, and we have to create time to be strategic and to think. And too many people are moving from Zoom meeting or video meeting or in-person meeting to meeting. They don't have time to think. They don't have time to connect with people. So slowing down, creating time for self-thought, for reflection, for thinking is really, really critical. That's a really, really probably the number one attribute that successful leaders have today, is that ability. The second is not being afraid to ask for input and advice and feedback, to be able to be vulnerable enough and humble enough to say, I don't have all the answers. I'm going to make mistakes. I need to learn not just what you have to think around me, but feedback on me. What can I do to be more effective? And the ability to ask for that in an authentic, sincere way, and then stop and listen and not get defensive and not react to it. So critical for leaders today. And we always talk, this is not a new concept, but the ability to learn. I mean, as a leader, you have to, and this goes back to creating time. If you're so busy in meetings or dealing with Wall Street or your investors or clients or the marketplace or technology, whatever your focus is as a C-level executive or senior leader, are you learning? Are you creating time to spend time? What's going on in the marketplace? What's happening in your industry? What's happening with consumers? Or your buyers or whoever your key stakeholders are, being externally focused. Leaders today are way too internally focused. They need to be more externally focused. They're too involved in the day to day. So those are just there's more, but that's let me start there. Those are some of the really key things that leaders need to focus on.
So say somebody is a leader and either you go in there to coach a CEO or just somebody in general asks you, what are some of the techniques that a CEO, let's say, is just overwhelmed with workload? What is some way that they could take time specifically and strategically to then think about what's going on at work, their life, or what are some tools that they can use?
Yeah, no, great question, Kosta. There's a couple of things you have to do. You got to start with that taking a step back, because most leaders today, including C-level executives, are not spending time where they need to. They're getting caught up in the meetings, the requests, and hey, can you be part of this? Can you be part of that? As a leader, you have to learn how to say no in a respectful, supportive way. You just can't be everything to everybody. You can't be everywhere. You have to recognize I need to spend time in a very strategic, effective way. Now, I'm not going to necessarily use Warren Buffett as a great example because he's more of an investor. But if you know anything about him, he really gets to know his industries. He gets to know the companies that he's invested in. Spends a lot of time meeting people, talking to people. But guess what? If you looked at his calendar, here's the guy, the most probably successful investor in the world, if ever. I mean, he doesn't have a calendar. It's blank. Okay. It's a true story. He did an interview recently, and people were amazed that they laughed because he's what? He's in his late 80s now, early 90s. So, but he's always been like this. It's not just a recent event. So that's an extreme example, but we're too caught up in our schedules of meetings. And as a leader today, you got to take a step back and really think about, where am I spending my time? That's the number one question that leaders today need to ask themselves. They need to disrupt their schedules, and not only for themselves, for their teams, for their organization. We're becoming a slave of video meetings, becoming a slave of the day-to-day. And don't be wrong, day-to-day and execution is critical. But it goes back to, as a leader, where are you spending your time? That's the number one most critical thing I've been seeing, not just recently, for years.
And we're, so we've got these kind of two schools of not even thought, but of being. So the younger generation is used to this more disrupted, agile pivot. Let's get things done. I don't believe in, working 80 hours a week, and God love them for that, right? I don't either. But yet they don't have the experience. So, business traditions are, there's a structure that is helpful that has worked through the years that they may not have. So reinventing that wheel isn't necessarily important. But taking those C-level executives and kind of teaching an old dog new tricks can also be difficult. So how do you marry the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think the good news is most executives, yes, they've gotten to where they've gotten to based upon their formula for success, whatever that may be. And in a lot of ways, we become, we want to call it addicted, or we get comfortable with that. And yes, the older you get, the more successful you get, the more accomplished you are, the more senior you are, the harder it is to take a step back and say, wait a minute, is my formula right? Do I need to modify it? So it all starts with mindset. Mindset's a big concept. It's been around for a long time, but I don't care where you are, who you are, what your background is, but you have to take a step back and say, do I have the right mindset to recalibrate and disrupt where I'm spending my time, how I'm approaching my role? Am I willing to modify my formula for success? And that requires change. And it requires us to think differently, see things differently. And that's why coaches and advisors are there, to be able to be an outside voice to talk them through how to do that, how to look at, how they're spending their time, how they're running their businesses, how they're managing their organizations, how they're developing the next generation of leaders, whatever their focuses may be, and how to do that differently. because it is about doing it differently. It is about change. And we have to be, we have to put some of our ego and our success. And that's the hardest thing to do, because the more successful you are, the harder it is to say, am I willing to disrupt and change my formula for success? But that's what gets the leader to be more effective in the future. The moment you settle, the moment you put it into auto drive, that's when you're in trouble. Not just as a leader, but as a business. And there's plenty of businesses, that are now buried on the side of a road, like the Blockbusters of the world, that were the leaders of their industries for many, many years, and they're done. Why? Because they put it in auto drive.
I definitely think the egos, like as soon as you're talking about that, about being coaches and stuff like that, I think that ego definitely gets in the way of a lot of people out there. Because before I even thought about I didn't even know the most successful CEOs and stuff had business coaches. It wasn't until I really got into the business world when I was later in life, whenever later is, my 20s, more getting involved in the world. It was wow, these top CEOs of these people that are crazy successful, they have coaches that they go to. And it was just kind of like a eye-opening experience. I think I was reading something about Steve Jobs had somebody specific for just to coach him at the presentations that he did and go through so many iterations. Can you talk about is there any pushback from certain CEOs, not hear feedback, or the certain CEOs that are at that top level recognize enough that they do need feedback to actually push them to get forward to the position they want to be in their company?
No, it's a great question. What I would say is this. Look, I've worked with many executives at the VP up to the C level, including CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. They're not always asking for a coach. Often it's the board of directors or their boss, the chair of the board, or the CEO, or whoever their boss may be, that says, hey, I think a coach would be helpful. And there's one very basic truism. I don't care who you are. I don't care who the coach is or the advisor is. But if you're not open and receptive to being coached and developed, it's not going to help. It's not going to work. So it all starts with you. It goes back to my earlier comment. Are you willing to be coached, or you're receptive and open-minded that says, I don't have all the answers. I don't have the formula for success completely nailed down. And maybe I got to take a step back and be willing to think about doing something differently for myself and learn. I remember working with one very, very famous executive, and I use this comment in my book. I talk about this concept, have you arrived? And the most dangerous thing that can happen to all of us, I don't care who we are, including the experts in our professions, whether you become a quote unquote leader in your company or not, you just can be just an expert in what you do for a living. But from the moment you feel you've arrived, which is, hey, I feel I know it all. I'm at the pinnacle of my career, my success, my expertise. Maybe I'm the leader in what I do for a living as far as thought leadership or technology or science or whatever it may be. But the moment you have that mindset is the moment you're susceptible for no longer learning, no longer being open and being curious. And those are characteristics, no matter who you are, you need to continue to have.
You talk about, God, all of that is so true. And you talk in your book about the secret sauce, and
Right.
and all of everything in that sauce is so critical. And it's about self-awareness and development and talk a little bit about all of those traits and characteristics that go into secret sauce.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could have used many, many different ingredients to the secret sauce. I like the concept of secret sauce, one, because I like to eat, by the way. And most of us, if we like to cook, we always have our secret sauces, right? And I had a lot of friends over the years of my career that were from the South, and especially when it came to barbecue, everyone liked to talk about their secret sauces. Anyway, so there's a lot of thing about that, right? We've already talked about feedback. Your ability to ask for feedback is a really critical aspect. Your ability to have passion, to figure out what you're passionate about and to live that passion. I mean, I'm very, very fortunate. I love what I do. And I've been in this industry for many, many years. But the fact that when I became a coach and be able to work with people and helping them make a difference in their lives, not just in their professions, but in their lives, that's part of my purpose and part of my passion. But yes, let's start with self-awareness, because that is the foundation. Self-awareness is a couple of things. There's some traditional tools out there like behavioral assessments. We talked about 360 assessment earlier, but you really need to understand who you are. You need to understand what makes you tick, why you get up in the morning, how you deal with pressure and stress, what triggers you emotionally, how do you manage your emotion more effectively. That's a big part of emotional intelligence, which I talk about in the book, which is a very important concept. So understanding how you impact others is really important. So that's self-awareness. Another aspect of self-awareness, and I talk about this in my book, is the two-sided coin. Do you really accept yourself? Do you kind of understand yourself and recognize, look, I don't care who you are. Yes, maybe there's that extreme example of someone who loves themselves so much they don't find anything wrong with
there's
themselves.
Plenty of people like that.
Well, guess what? That's not really the majority of the human race, right? The majority of the human race, we all have insecurities. We all have things we don't like about ourselves, whether it's how we look, how we talk, how we respond. It doesn't really, there's all kinds of qualities and attributes that we are insecure about. And it's an amazing thing that happens into your life at some point when you simply accept yourself for who you are. It doesn't mean that you don't stop developing yourself. It doesn't mean that you're not still trying to learn and grow and be a better person, but you still have to accept yourself and get comfortable in your own skin. So that's a really, really big part of the secret sauce.
I noticed, especially too, when you're hitting those points of self-awareness, there's so many things in the book that you can implement. It's often overwhelming to be wow, I can do all these things. I can be better in all these different areas. I'm curious to hear your opinion on this, but to me, when I read the book and I think about it, it really seems like everything starts with yourself and fixing yourself, your issues. And then that is then you can transport that and it's kind of looking for the right word to say brushed upon other people. But if you're doing the right things and you're leading by example and you've done the self-work, it almost feels as though all these traits, if you master them and you get them under, then they will brush off on other people.
That's a really great observation, Kosta, and you're right. And I think, maybe you could relate, both of you could relate to this. I know I went through this phase when you try to be there for everyone else, whether it's your people, your family, your friends, your community, whatever it may be. And I talk about sort of the 4 quadrants in life, which I just named: yourself, your family, your community, and then your job, right? What happens is if you don't take care of yourself, how effective are you going to be with the world around you? So yes, you've got to start with yourself, and it's a lifelong journey. And one thing that's really critical, because and I talk about this briefly in the book, but just because we know doesn't mean we do. So you can read a book like my book, and yes, there's a lot of information there, but to apply it and to live that's practice, that's incorporation, and you can't do everything at once. It is about incremental knowledge, incremental improvement, incremental evolvement of who we are as people. And for some of it, it's a lifelong journey. Look, the things that get me into trouble, Lisa, Kosta, still gets me into trouble today. It hasn't changed my whole life. Am I better at it? Yes. But do they still get me into trouble? Absolutely.
Right.
Especially when I get triggered.
I said the same thing. It's what? We're about tweaking and changing. Whatever our issues are, they just become, I'll speak for myself. Whatever my issues are, they're probably the same as when I was in my 20s, but they're more manageable. And I work on self-awareness. I'm into all that stuff. And so the more we work on ourselves, the less we are triggered. That allows our communications and interactions with other people to be so much softer, right? But if you're just reading it and you're not embodying it, it's not going to be effective.
Well, and again, I agree with you. And I at the same time, you don't want to over rotate because you still have to live your life. You got to be there for your family and your friends and your work and your community. But I think it's important. There's no such thing as balance, right? Balance is not a 50-50, whatever the percentages are, 25-25 split. It's really about quality time and focus and showing up and being present in those parts of your life and recognizing how to show up and be mindful and recognizing you're not going to be perfect. You're going to make mistakes. Don't be beating yourself up when you do. There's so many aspects of this. So yes, you've got to start with yourself, but at the same time, you're still got to live your life out there. I'm not talking about becoming a hermit and waiting for you to find enlightenment before you go out in the world, right? You still have to live your life every day. But as I said earlier, pause, stop, slow down, reflect, think. I don't care who you are, no matter where you are in your life. Because we get caught up in the day-to-day, we get caught up in the chaos of the world around us. and you got to take care of yourself physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, so you can be effective with the world around you.
That brings us to, you're at that point, you're learning about yourself, you're being in the world, you're whatever, self-actualizing. It's so overused, but feedback is so important. So when I first read the 360 degree feedback, I thought, oh boy, I'd probably have a hard time with that. And one of the things that came up was, okay, so I don't have a hard time getting feedback from someone that I would respect. But if I got feedback of something negative on myself that was coming from someone who I could tell had either envy or hadn't actually done, that in their life, so they weren't qualified to give that kind of feedback. How feedback is so important. What are some, what's a framework? A couple of things here. What would be a framework to ask for feedback? And how should you kind of vet someone out to see if they are the right person to be giving that kind of feedback? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so you said a couple of things that are really important. I mean, and some of this part of it is security. So one, we have to start with being comfortable with the concept of feedback. Some of us are afraid to get feedback. Some of us are afraid for people to give us feedback because it can hurt. It can strike a chord. And if we're working so hard to be a certain way, we're fearful of someone telling us we're not doing what we're trying to do. And that can be really, really hard. So we have to overcome the fear and the worry and the insecurity of not hearing what we want to hear. Now, you got to start with that. Now, you said something interesting. Sometimes we're going to get feedback from people that maybe we're not going to respect, or they're not coming from a good place. Well, you've got to take that at face value. If someone's giving you feedback that's not from the right place, that maybe hasn't the best level of maturity, I still say rise above, be respectful and say, look, thank you. I appreciate your feedback. If you've got questions, ask questions. And the questions may be if something they may have missed. But at the same time, you still have to say, look, I appreciate, giving me feedback. Now, if it's coming from a really bad place, if the feedback is really meant to hurt you and meant to be disrespectful, that's a whole different story. That's not really feedback. That's argumentative. That's a way to kind of trigger you. That's a whole different concept. And don't take the bait. Look up and say, look, if you really want to have a conversation, let's have a conversation. I'm happy to chat it through, but what do you want to do? You want to de-escalate, especially the person themselves emotional and triggered. They're not giving you feedback; they're venting. So that's a whole different category. Okay, but why is feedback so powerful? So there's a couple of really important things, Lisa and Kosta. One, you're letting people know that you care about their opinion. Their opinion matters. I care about what you think. That's number one. Number two, your feedback to me, your input is important, but also I am receptive to feedback and input. I don't have all the answers. There are things I'm actually working on to get better at. You're sending that message that I'm not perfect. I'm trying to get better. There are things I'm trying to work on. I don't care who you are, where you are in your life. There's always something to work on. Always. That never ends. So you're sending some very, very important messages. And going back to your question of framework, be specific. If you want to say, hey, I love to get feedback. Well, most people are going to really struggle with that. But if you're going to say, you know what, I realize that I'm not always a good listener. I'm just trying to offer my opinion. And then I'm asking people what they think. And I know that's not really effective. I'm trying to get better at that. I'm trying to work on that. Have I gotten better at it? If not, any suggestions that you have for me? That's a very specific question or a specific thing that I'm trying to work on. So be specific. And then most importantly, listen, as I said earlier, don't get defensive. Don't try to justify. Don't make facial expressions. Don't change your body posture. Be receptive. Because if you do all those things, are you going to get feedback ever again? No. People are not going to waste their time. So you're sending a very positive, important message by asking for it, but you got to ask for it in a very, very effective way.
Yeah, completely agree. So say you get hired to come into a company and coach one of the CEO of the company or a leader at the company. What does that process look like? What is the first 30-day kind of rollout, or what are you going to do with that person first?
Wow, that's a really specific question, Kosta. So, believe it or not, it starts with the relationship. You really have to establish openness and transparency and trust. So, my job is not to show up as the expert, is to show up and really establish a relationship. And for some people, that's very easy to do. But we all know for some people, a little bit more reserved, a little bit more skeptical, especially if they're not necessarily wanting to be there initially. You've got to be patient. You'll let that evolve. So establishing a relationship, establishing trust, establishing openness and transparency and confidentiality, that we're here for each other, that I'm here to get to know you and you're here to get to know me, that we're really trying to develop a partnership. That's really, really critical. That evolves differently depending on the person's personality. The second thing is creating really investment of time into the process and the program, meaning we're going to meet at least every 2 weeks, sometimes weekly, depending on the urgency of the issues or the needs or the complexity. So, it's kind of laying a groundwork and foundation of expectations of how often we're going to meet, what are we going to work on? What does the process look like? And frankly, depending on the executive and the organization, the culture, the process is going to evolve organically or change depending on what we're trying to work on. But going to, what we talked about earlier, it starts with self-awareness. So if they haven't done it, I'm going to put them through a behavioral assessment, a tool I'm a huge fan of called the Predictive Index, or PI, which I talk about in the book. I'm also going to do a verbal 360 assessment, which are interviews to talk to peers, a boss if they have one, and then direct reports as well as other key stakeholders. So I can really understand this person in a very comprehensive way. And then I'm going to provide a feedback report, confidential, doesn't say who said what, that summarizes, how they're perceived, both in terms of their strengths as well as their potential development opportunities, and not just opportunities in general to be more aware of the impact they have on others. And then I'm also, in that report, I'm also going to capture their self-assessment to say, hey, this is how you assessed yourself. Here's how you're seen by others. What's similar? What's different? Where are the gaps? How do you reconcile that? And then we're going to put together essentially an action plan. And then, of course, in between all that, there's coaching, there's discussions. We're going to talk about real life situations. Most leaders today have conflict, right? How do I deal with the conflict of my direct report or my peer or key person in my organization or maybe someone on the board? So how do I deal with a relationship that's gone sour or that's not effective? Or how do I deal with getting my organization through a massive change? Or how do I get them to another level of effectiveness and success? Maybe it's my leadership team. Maybe we're not aligned. How do I gain greater alignment? Maybe I have a cultural issue with my organization. How do I create a stronger culture? So there's a litany of potential additional, what I call strategic issues and needs and challenges that we're going to get into. So part of it's coaching, which is what I started with in terms of the self-awareness and the interviews and the feedback. But there's also what I call the advisory role or the consulting role, which is the strategic part of their job and how to be effective. So I try to do a hybrid approach. Honestly, Kosta, I'm not the traditional coach is really going to focus on the behavioral side. I think that's really foundational, critical, but it can't be all about that. And frankly, a lot of leaders today have been through all that. So for them, it's missing tools and knowledge in their toolbox and how to get to the next level.
I mean, that was an amazing breakdown. The word that I kept going back to and thinking about is time. And specifically, by what I mean that is implementing those things take time. And I think especially now, everybody wants that instant gratification. They're not willing to see how long things take. What I kept kind of thinking there too is, how long does that process usually take? And the reason I ask that is because let's say you're hired as a coach or you're in a service-based business and you're providing a service for a client. Yeah. You're always or you sometimes feel pressure, like I need to deliver results to this client, but well and good that whether it's a marketing plan or you're coming in to coach to actually implement the change and do this properly, it's going to take time. So how do you balance that idea of, hey, I need to deliver a result so this person actually can feel that my time's worth it or what they're paying for is worth it, with that idea of actually doing what's needed, even though that might take longer on a time period to go for?
Yeah, I remind people usually with a couple of stories. So I won't get into both of them, but I'll use one we can all relate to for the most part. So it's going to the gym, right? And this is a great time of year because we enter the winter, especially here in the Northeast, where I am at least. or depending on where you are in the world, there's also the New Year resolution element, right? For those of us like, this is the year I'm going to get fit or healthy, or I'm going to lose weight, or whatever your physical goals may be. And what ends up happening is we end up going to the gym, and I think we can all relate to this a little bit, and we work out like crazy, and all of a sudden we're in a lot of pain, and we're not seeing, one, it hurts, it sucks, we don't feel great, and second, it's like, well, I don't feel like anything's changing, and we stop, right? And we stop for a lot of reasons, but we predominantly stop because, to your earlier point, we do live in a world, we want instant gratification, instant results, instant success, instant whatever it may be. And, when you're working out, again, whatever your goals may be, it just may be to be healthy. It may be to get in better condition physically, maybe to lose weight, maybe to gain muscle, whatever your goals may be, it's a process. And for any of us who's ever exercised, we know it takes months before you actually get to see results. And it takes discipline, it takes commitment, and you got to go to at least 2-3 times a week. And if you're trying to sleep better or whatever the objectives may be, and like behavioral modification and change, learning new skills, changing your day, your schedule, where you spend your time, getting to the next level as a leader. It's a commitment. It's a knowledge. It's a skill base like any other profession. So you have to think about it in incremental, intermediate steps, because you're not going to get from A to Z overnight. It's not an overnight success story. It goes back to what I said earlier. Just because we know, we don't do. It's not a light switch. So we have to be realistic about how long it's going to take. Yes, sometimes there's low-hanging fruit and utilize that, but we have to also understand that it's a process, and there needs to be commitment, there needs to be discipline in order for that change and that evolution to occur.
I love that example. We're both all into fitness here, me and Lisa. So I think I love how you'd explain that in that terms. I think antidote is the right word, or something with that. But I think specifically giving examples and stories like that, what you said, that they're instantly clicked in my mind. And I think a lot of people, when they get into this kind of world of business and stuff like that, there's a lot to like take in. For example, as we were saying before, like there's a lot of things that you can do to become a better leader. But I think those little kind of stories and things that people can connect in their brain, make it a lot easier for people to understand. That leads me into my next question. How do you, and this is something we're going through now, especially for me personally, being a younger entrepreneur, of how do you build a high performing team?
Yeah, that's a really key question, right? So first, you got to start with, do you really understand each other? Do you understand how you think? Do you understand how you process, how you make decisions? Are you willing, and this is a scary word, do you have conflict? Okay, because we've become a very conflict-averse society, right? The whole woke culture aspect, but even before COVID and before all the social injustice, real issues, by the way, and movement, we had conflict issues in corporate America. We did. It's just gotten worse. But the challenge is, are you willing to have courageous dialogue? Can you be respectful and agree to disagree? Are we willing to allow people to be heard? So there's a big concept in corporate America that's to gain momentum the last few years. I'll talk about in the book as well briefly. I'll put more emphasis on it now, and that's around psychological safety, which essentially is creating an environment where people feel they can be heard. They have a voice. They're going to be respected. No matter who they are, how young or old they are, how new they are, how long they've been worked there, it doesn't make a difference. Everyone has a voice. Everyone has an opinion, and they should be heard. And you have to create a work environment that's safe, that people feel they can challenge the status quo. They have ideas. They can fail. I talk about this in the book, in terms, can you ride the wave, right? How do you create stability for yourself and your organization during times of chaos? And so you've got to create an environment where it's okay to fail. It's okay to make a mistake. So communication, transparency, openness is critical, but creating that right work environment. And you got to get to understand your people. What makes them tick? How do they think? How do they process? What is success for them? What are their passions? What do they aspire to be? What keeps them awake at night? So you got to get to know everybody on the team individually, but they all need to know each other, and you have to be able to operate in a certain way. And that goes back to that creating that safe work environment. It's really, really critical. And where failure is not a bad word, mistakes are not a bad word.
You talk a lot. This kind of dovetails on the end of this. That you talk a lot in your book also about the executive presence. and so that could go a long way to creating that type of culture. Can you talk a little bit about what executive presence is and why it's so important and how a leader could increase that?
Yeah, I mean, executive presence is applicable to all of us, okay? So whether you've got an official leadership title or not, it's really, again, about having emotional intelligence, meaning, do I understand the impact I have on others? Do I have the ability to be emotionally effective? What I mean by that is, can I manage my emotions in a way where I'm not going to explode or get triggered? So as you probably remember, I got a whole chapter in my book around triggers. And I keep on referring to that because everyone has triggers. We all get triggered by a personality, by someone someone says, or by style, or by a person treating a person a certain way or not treating them a certain way. So there's a whole litany of what triggers us, and our ability to manage our emotions and how we show up and have presence because we actually care about the impact we have on others. Are we able to be situationally effective? Can we change our approach depending who our audience is? That's part of really some of the really key aspects of leadership is our ability to be agile depending who our audience is and recognize that it's not about being a chameleon. It's not about being disauthentic. If anything, you want to be authentic. You want to be transparent. You want to be yourself, but you can also be situational depending who your audience is.
This has been fantastic, and I know we're coming to the end of our hour. So everybody, click away and get this book. Can you see it? There we go.
We got 2 books on the screen. We both picked up our own copies.
That was very, very nice of you. Look, I mean, I wrote this book for one reason, is I wanted to make a difference. So it goes back to what we talked about in the very beginning. Who are we? What really inspires us every day? What are we trying to grow and learn to be? What's our passion? What's the impact we want to have? And you've got to start with that. That's gonna allow you to live not only authentic a life, but also to create authenticity for yourself. So I appreciate wanting to have that conversation.
We appreciate you taking the time to come and have this discussion. We look forward to having you back, and we'll talk with you soon.